This is pertaining to the project of Comrade 073 called Form and Scale. And it's kind of, as I was talking earlier in the first video, it is the prehistory of this project, in a sense. I'm presenting the project that I was developing at my doctorate thesis. I have a background, as I told, I have a background as a musician, as an artist, as a philosopher as well. So the first project has had to do with mainly, I mean, at face value, with musical aesthetics, even though it's not really a project about musical aesthetics, as I think we've seen in the last discussion we had. It veers toward ontology, and there was a kind of a big discussion about the notion of ontology, and that was the main topic last time, which was cut off because my computer halted because I spilled coffee on it. So here we are again. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint again and rehearse what we, let me see, yeah, rehearse what we were seeing last time, in order for those who are watching to get to know it, get to follow it better. Okay, so here we go. So this is the name of the presentation, is Indeterminacy at Work. Are you seeing the PowerPoint? Is it sharing properly?
Yeah, it's sharing properly.
Yeah. Okay. So here we go. Indeterminacy at Work, post-Cajun aesthetics, and the problem of organization. Right. So this is part of the. It's a presentation which is part of the Form and Scale project. So I'm trying to explain the relationship between the two projects, right? Form and Scale project. Form and Scale intends to be a philosophical study in organization through its mediations. Starting from the sensible form exemplified in art practice, it tries to disentangle a concept of organization from sensibility by addressing the problem of different scales of organization, from the one that is immediately present at hand to different levels of untethering from the sensible apparatus. This put forward a function of the concept that is to render somewhat intelligible that which escapes formal integration by our sensibility. Politics and economics exemplify this untethering and the mechanisms by which intelligence tries to retrieve them. A perspectival but not perspectivist philosophy is called for in order to make sense of these different worlds. Well, this is just the abstract of the project, which is, I think, rather cryptic at this point. But the idea is to take the exemplification of organization that I was trying to, that I extracted from post-Cajun aesthetics, and the normative order that was embedded in there, to try to kind of generalize this notion to organization in general, particularly towards political and economic organization, and also with the idea of the difference in scale. Scale is understood here as something that is a kind of a disturbance in formal integration. Of course, one can presuppose that something on a different scale has also its own organization or its own form, in a sense. But from the standpoint of the subject, of the transcendental subject, scale is something that, as exemplified in the classic Kantian Sublime notion, the idea that scale defeats some function of our recognition of form, of organizational form. So this is the basic idea, and actually in a little bit of in a nutshell, the relationship between the both projects, I think. So the origin of the project is this L'Indetermination à l'œuvre, which was my doctorate dissertation. And here I talk a little bit about it, approach the problems of the ontology of art as challenged by Cage's oeuvre, by transferring them to the theory of action, the inferential pragmatic infrastructure of normativity. In it, a model of critical composition was proposed that took not just sounds, but the actions that produced the musical sounds along with the rules, not just of composition, but of acting in accord with a score as its material. This opened up a common ground between the aesthetic problems and the political problems, made explicit by the replacement of an ontology of art by a morphology of the artwork, and of aesthetic ontology of objects to a dynamic morphology that is an ontology of processes. I'm not really sure about this formulation yet, but well, okay, there it is. Cage's anti-correlationist stance, let sounds be sounds, was then requalified as a putative absence of intentional organization in the work, which was supposed to grant it its independence from the subjectivity of the composer. This was itself recast as a form of organization. Well, you know, the common conception about Cage is that he's anti-organization, anti-form, anti-formal integration, anti-synthesis. So the idea to let sounds be, there will be a slide about this, but the idea to let sound be sounds purports to, in a sense, let immanence run its course, so to speak, something like this. So there is a presupposition of a kind of immanence that is not pre-formatted for any subjective synthesis. So his techniques are supposed to block the formal integration into a unitary work in order for us to get in contact with something that is not pre-formatted by and for the synthetical structures of the subjectivity, something like that. So this is the idea. I mean, this is the common story that is told about Cage. So my idea is to get to understand this lack of organization as a form of organization, in the sense that he is using the for a normative infrastructure, what I'm calling a normative infrastructure of the action itself, as material, in the sense of something to be worked upon, something to be the material of his work, in a sense, the material that is being elaborated. So realism was then indexed not to the absence of subjectivity that opened up to a natural given, which is this normal, this common way of seeing what his work is about, but to the variability of form itself and the different ways of integration of the outside it can envisage. To present that initial work is the aim of this presentation. So this will deal only with the indeterminacy project, not directly with the form and scale. It's kind of the transition from that work to this one, and I'm presenting it in order to have you help me to make this transition and have your suggestions in order to put me in a more fruitful path, right? So, any questions up until now?
Yeah. So I think I kind of understand what you're saying, but what did you mean by formal integration exactly? Because I didn't catch that so much.
Okay, let me just just a sec. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I don't like to talk to you with the PowerPoint screen on. So I mean the idea that in music there is or in an artwork there is something which makes it distinctive from its surroundings, right? So in music, that is the question of what is part of a work and what is not part of the work, because music is always plunged in a world of sounds. So there is like an intentional stance that isolates this structure from that which is not the work, even though both are present at the same time. So formal integration in the sense that there is some, I'm presupposing this, I'm not really describing it, but I'm taking the Kantian account as an example. I mean, as something I have in the back of my mind, right? So there is a formal integration means that there is some synthetic function of a subject that is capable not just of isolating those elements which are part of a work from those which are not, but of integrating those into a once again a presupposed coherence. So why am I saying a presupposed coherence? Because it's not necessarily coherent in the sense of a system. For instance, if you read Adorno, there is an idea of a integration of the non-identical. This integration of the non-identical is the integration into the work of something that is not pre-formatted by the logic of the work itself. This is kind of abstract, but in terms of musical technique, something like atonal music, in a sense, wherein there is no system of previous system of coherence that is guiding the options that are taken by the composer. There's this whole field of possibilities that is open, and you can the appearance of the non-identical is something that is present in the sense that there's a possibility to happen something inside the musical discourse that is not pre-arranged by the coherent system that is guiding it, right? So this is kind of the idea of a formal unity that the subject is capable of isolating, in a sense, and it's internal paths as well as something that is supposed to be, even if it's disruptive towards a pre-existing logic, even if it's disruptive, is supposed to be integrated by the subject inside something which is unified and isolated from its surroundings, in that sense, right? This is what I mean by formal integration. I mean, it was kind of long, but
so I mean, in the act of making music, producing music, or performing music, I mean, you must have some, or would you agree that you must have some kind of criteria for the performer to determine if they are, playing the music properly?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, is that something along the lines of what you're saying, where you have this criteria that is subjectively recognizable? Like
intersubjectively, I would say intersubjectively recognizable because of this normative infrastructure, which has to do with this idea, the criteria of correction, of course, of the performances. Right. This is right. So what you are saying is that you are integrating the role of the performer as well. I was talking more about the role of the listener, of someone who receives the information and is capable of isolating and of taking it as a system separate from its surroundings, right? But of course, this is also formatted by the normative infrastructure in the sense of the rules of action that is taken to be that which compose a determinate musical culture, or whatever, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's more to be unpacked there, because it's not just musical culture; it's like human action in general. And afterwards, I will use Wittgenstein and Brandon and other philosophers that are interested in this idea of a normativity of action that is tethered to the conceptual order as well.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay. Okay, let me go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. Do you have it? Is okay. So the project, the initial project, the Indeterminacy at work, was that central problem. Analytic ontologies of the musical work tend to emphasize the conditions of identification of the artwork as a guarantor of its existence. So something exists as long as it's capable of being identified. This is the basic, I think, tenet of most of analytic ontologies. I will talk a little bit about analytic ontologies afterwards, as you know, because we veered into a discussion about ontology at that point in the last video. But okay, so Platonism, I take here two examples. Platonism, which is a position espoused by Levinson, Cavey, etc., considers the work the instantiated sound pattern, wherein sound pattern means an abstract, non-spatial temporal pattern that is indicated by the composer in a score, right? This is kind of bizarre. It's Platonist because it's not, there is a component in the work that is non-spatial temporal, like, and at the same time they call it a sound pattern, but because this is really bizarre, because the sound can't be non-spatial temporal, I think, but the sound pattern is non-spatial temporal. The idea that is an abstract pattern which is understood analogically to a mathematical structure that is non-spatial temporal, that is instantiated in a performance, in sounds. It is embodied in sounds. This is the basic idea of Platonism in the ontology of musical work. Somebody wanted to say something. I heard somebody say something.
No, just saying hi. I'm here.
Ah, you're there. Okay, great. So, nominalism, the position espoused by Nelson Goodman, considers the work to be determined by an inscription in a notational system where an inscription doesn't have an upper limit. Both a note and a whole score are inscriptions, and notational system is a technical term for a symbolic system that preserves a one-to-one relationship between marks and compliance. Marks are inscriptions, it's the same thing here. The work is the class of performances that perfectly comply with a score. Why does he put forth this convoluted definition of what counts as a musical work? Because he wants to evict the sound pattern. He doesn't want to have nothing that is non-spatial temporal, nothing that is an abstract object in his ontology. So this is why he's a nominalist. He'll try to reduce everything to notations and sounds. So the price he pays is that for his notational system to work, there is a strange counterintuitive conclusion, is that if you play a work and you miss one note, it's not that you play the work badly, it's you didn't play the work. This is a strange conclusion. So if you miss a note, you didn't play the work. This is the price he has to pay for adopting this nominalism about artworks in general, but the notational system is devised specifically for musical works because he has to defend this one-to-one relationship between marks and compliance, since he wants to avoid the Sorites paradox. He doesn't want to have how do you say, deslizamento de identidade, sliding of the identity of a work note by note, you know, something like that. So in order for this to not happen, since he can't appeal to a sound pattern, abstract sound pattern, he only gets to appeal to the notational system, and the notational system must propose a one-to-one relationship and must be perfectly complied, right? So both positions stem from the consideration of a musical work as a case of one in many. There is some invariance that must be accounted for. This is the basic problem. It's because musical works are things that are reinstantiated, performed more than once, and yet they have the same, they receive the same name, they are counted as the same, right? Like two performances of the Fifth Symphony, of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, are still Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So it's a basic problem. Post-Cajun aesthetics tend to rely on indeterminacy. That is, there is in principle no way to identify a work from its sound world alone. That is, this proviso is important from its sound world alone, right? Because in my work, I'm proposing that you can't identify a work from the rules that are mobilizing what will result in a performance of this work. So the rules can identify a work, not just this sounding result, right? So this is what I'm calling a normative turn in post-Cajun aesthetics. Okay. So preliminary considerations. This is really quick. I already presented this last time. The object of research is a practical repertoire that uses indeterminacy of results as a way of adapting itself to the site of presentation, and the site of presentation be urban spaces like lofts, bar, rock venues, etc. I mean, this is just I'm nodding here to my pals that are doing underground music here in Brazil, and at a point we were feeding on Cajun indeterminacy in order to have kind of musical systems. We were understanding the works we played as musical systems that are flexible, sufficiently flexible to sustain themselves in different venues, in different conditions. So this is what I'm calling punk cage. So in the Brazilian scene, 3 of these spaces, I just exemplified this. I thought I was going to show some musical examples, but I think we better concentrate on the philosophical side. This is just a proviso, right? So the second consideration is about ontology. This is where things got not heated, but interesting. Last time we were really talking about this concept of ontology. So the critical approach to analytic ontology, my critical approach, right, asks for a clarification on what ontology means here. I use the distinction drawn by Peter Wolfendale between continental and analytic ontologies as stemming from the difference between the question of being qua being, paradigmatically Heidegger, and being qua totality, paradigmatically Quine. Analytic ontology of art puts itself squarely on the second camp as it interrogates among that which exists, totality A, to what category of being, totality B, works of art belong. It is concerned only collaterally with the meaning of being, as it only asks about that which is considered as existing and its mode of existence. So it's presupposing some concept of being and not really approaching the problem of the meaning of being, which is typically the Heideggerian question. Is presupposing this some concept of being, and it is a kind of it just asks criteria for considering something as existing, right? So if you read On What There Is by Quine, his essay On What There Is, it's basically he's putting forward the idea of an ontological commitment, right? Which is the value taken by a variable. So any value that is taken by a variable, by a quantified variable, will be considered as existent. This is an example of this kind of interrogation, right? But Quine is much more general than what analytic ontology of art is doing, because analytic ontology of art is trying to elucidate the mode of existence of individual artworks or individual musical works and things like that. So it's not so much a delimitation of a given totality, but a description of the conditions that an object must satisfy in order to be counted as part of a totality, namely the totality that is called artworks, something like that, right? Any questions? Nope.
No, so far I'm good.
Okay. So why is analytic ontology important? Analytic ontology is taken to be a philosophical refinement and reification from empirical art practice. It takes its cue from elements of contingent practice. Musical works are repeatable, performable, have usually a distinctive shape, etc., and turns it into a metaphysical and or logical category, respectively, Platonism and nominalism, for instance. I'm calling the nominalist view a logical as opposed to a metaphysical category, because, well, nominalism is supposed to get rid of anything metaphysical. So I tend to think of Nelson Goodman, which is overtly anti-metaphysical and post-Carnapian philosopher, as putting forward a logical conception of artworks, not necessarily a metaphysical one. Well, it exemplifies both elements of common practice that are supposed to be necessary and are thus selected by ontology. In a way, analytic ontology concerns us as a symptom of what is taken to be necessary in the concept of a musical work. This is what interests us, right? Interests me. So B, against itself, against why is analytic ontology important against itself? It's a way that philosophy, by obeying its own momentum while responding to a common sense notion, come to produce models that distance themselves from their targets. This interests me as a way to elucidate this wandering of philosophy from its targets. The targets it's purported to model, right? So this is the problem I see, basic problem I see with analytic ontology. It becomes an exercise in philosophy that loses its object, in a sense, even though it is motivated by some collection of objects. So ontological questions that I separated from this critical study. From ontology, I separated 4 questions. What is a work of art, which is the ontological question? How to identify something as a work of art, which is an epistemological question. How to identify that which is a work of art. C, how to identify a work as the work it is, which is the epistemological question about the identity of the particular work. So this is kind of tricky in order to differentiate from the previous question, right? So D, what makes the work what it is? Ontological question about the identity of the particular work. So there are 2 general questions: what is a work of art in general, and how to identify something as a work of art, which is an ontological and epistemological general questions about the category of work of art. And then the questions about identity within the work of art, not identity of work of art or works of art, right? So how to identify a work as the work that it is. So the question is not to identify something as being a work of art, but to identify something as being the something that is a work of art that it is. So this is kind of this is what Goodman was trying to develop with his notational system, to build a system that would enable us to identify musical works without any ambiguity, logical ambiguity, right? So it's not so much about identifying something as music, but identifying something as the something that it is, right? So, and what makes the work what it is for Nelson Goodman, using Goodman's example, it is the fact that is notated in a notational system. It is the particular inscription that the work is in a notational system that makes it what it is. And how do you identify it? The instantiations, the different instantiations of this inscription in a notational system counts as the same work, as long as they perfectly comply with it, right? There aren't errors. So so indeterminacy, I'm not so much defining indeterminacy here, but using an example from Cage himself, which is this page from his Winter Music, which is described by this musicologist James Pritchett. There are anywhere from 1 to 61 chords scattered over each page. Each chord either consists of 1 to 10 pitches or is a cluster, these later notated as 2 pitches with a rectangle above. There are 2 clef signs for each chord. If the 2 clefs are identical, then all the notes of the chord are read in that clef. If the clefs differ, then some of the notes are read in one clef, some in the other. For chords with 2 notes or cluster, 1 note is read in each clef. So you don't have to memorize the details. The idea is just that there is kind of not in the Goodman sense, but there is a notational system here that gives you options, different options. And the problem is that it is not possible to retrace the identity of the work from the performance to the score. What the Goodman idea was aiming at was what philosopher Lydia Gür calls a retraceability condition. That is the idea that you can go from score to performance, right, which is trivial, but you can retrieve the identity of the work from the performance if you know the relevant rules of the notational system that gave rise to it. Okay, so the problem here is that you can't do this in an indeterminate score. Not because it is ontologically indeterminate, but because it puts a whole lot of options that don't allow you to retrace the identity of the score from the resulting performance. And this is just part of the problem, because here I'm expressing this connection between a score and the result as a condition of identification because I'm using Goodman's notion. But for Cage, the idea was exactly to not be able to identify a particular work from its score. So the score wasn't really wasn't supposed to be an identification, an identifying condition, even though he was used to produce a result. So I think the underlying philosophy of Cage is much more pragmatist in the sense that those scores are fathomed in order to produce results that are unpredictable by the composer himself. So this is what he aimed for. So although the problem of identifying an object, re-identifying an object or event as the same becomes problematic here. So why is post-Cagean aesthetics important? the aesthetics of John Cage also furnishes me with two elements: a counter example to common practice.
Hello.
Yeah.
This is Reza. I just wanted to ask you a question before I'm totally lost.
Okay, sorry.
Let me turn this on so it becomes more interactive.
Yeah.
I follow what the actual theory is trying to produce, I think. So I follow your target in terms of being able to define art or the work of art or the work of music. Like last time we spoke as something that has absolute interiority and is not predestined by a conceptual definition based on some putative idea of what this work of art needs to be, but have the work of art kind of speak for itself. What I don't get is how are you going to deploy analytical philosophy for rendering that? Because analytical philosophy is all about rules, preordained rules, according to which you make sense of things based on a preordained grammar. And my comparison, at least in my mind, is what Badiou uses model theory for. I mean, he has used model theory in contrast to something like analytical philosophy in order to show that that type of freedom that you are looking for is actually much more observable or practicable using model theory as opposed to analytical philosophy, or following something similar to analytical philosophy. Now, you can completely ignore my comment about model theory, but my question generally was, how are you reconciling these two together? Because in my mind, they are kind of different. What analytical philosophy aims to produce and the type of interiority that you're asking or you're trying to give to the work of art.
Yes, I understand. Yeah, I think in order to understand what I'm doing, we have to make an internal differentiation within analytic philosophy. What I'm doing in the first part is taking a critical stance against what I'm calling analytic ontology of artworks, and this is exactly what you were talking about. The idea that you can describe once and for all every instantiation of a determinate concept. If the concept is determinate, like the concept of artwork, there should be a determinate condition for its deployment. And so analytic ontology of artworks tries to investigate what these conditions are, right? This is perfectly correct. But there's an internal differentiation, because I'm not really married to analytic philosophy, first of all, right? So it's not really that I'm defining myself as an analytic philosopher. I think I'm not married to it. But in this work, in the Indeterminacy at Work project, I was putting forward the Wittgensteinian idea of philosophy, which is, I mean, broadly, I'm talking about a broadly Wittgensteinian idea, which is not Fregean, fundamentally not Fregean anymore. I mean, the second Wittgenstein. So the idea that meaning as use, and the idea that this has to do with rules, but there are ways to deploy rules that make these work against each other, one rule against another. So this, I will get to that. There is a specific model that I take from a very weird guy called Henry Flint, which is called constitutive dissociation, right? So it's a way to like hack into what I'm calling the normative infrastructure, and to produce a practice that is, even though it is embedded in a determinate practice, like for instance art, it can be viewed as something other than art now, because there is a disruption from inside the practice by a rule, by an heterogeneous rule that was put there, like that was hacked into it. So this is kind of the model. So the way
before you continue.
Sorry.
No,
you want to? Yeah, let me just finish. So.
Sure.
Okay. So the way I'm understanding Cage is okay. I'll have to skip some chapters in order to say this. But, the idea, the Robert Brandam's idea of implicit rules that are implicit in practice and rules that are explicit, gives me something like a model for understanding this. So the Cagean practice, what interests me is that it is both an instance of constitutive dissociation, as Henry Flint understands it, and this constitutive dissociation is to be explicated as the contradiction between an explicit rule and an implicit norm of a practice. So the problem is what's happening in 4 minutes 33. He's using basically the normal components of a concert situation. You have to keep silent, and you have to watch what's going on stage, right? But the content of the act is not filled with a content. He is trying to the explicit rule is to do nothing. Just do nothing. Don't play, right? Don't play nothing at the piano. So this is a rule that is in a sense contradicts normal practice, but it is nevertheless it is carried on by an implicit norm of practice. That is the norm of practice of concert music, something like that. So this is the basic idea. I mean, the really, really basic idea. And what interests me is the fact that you can produce actions or results from an intervention into these rules of deployment. I mean, these rules, different rules of implicit rules, right? Robert Brandam's philosophy tries to furnish us with a way to make explicit that which was implicit in the norms of practice, right? But what I'm trying to do is not just to make explicit what is implicit in norms of practice, but to hack it from within and to produce something like a generic practice. This is what I was talking about last 2 weeks ago. A generic practice by not a wholesale exit from art practice, but a piecemeal revision of the normative components of this practice. If you are capable of making explicit the implicit norms of a specific practice, it is possible to take these norms as material and piece by piece revise them, producing constitutive dissociations that effaces the configuration of the practice itself. This is what I was trying to do, and it's kind of rehearsing the ideal of the avant-garde that Peter Berger and other theorists are talking about, the idea of the exiting of art and the unity of art and life. But then the idea was to was a wholesale rejection of art practice, and this turns out to be basically the invention of other artworks. Now you have ready-mades and stuff, and art is the same basically. So I'm not so interested in rejecting a whole field of practice, but of revising piece by piece, not the materials, specific materials of music, namely sounds, but the rules of constitution, in the sense of the rules that are followed by the people that are constituting the practice, right? The revision one by one of these rules in order to construct something like a generic practice, in the sense that is a practice that there is a different kind of indeterminacy there, because we don't know what it is, basically.
Well,
Can I just propose also a supplementary answer to Reza on this point?
Okay.
Just because also, I mean, I'm very much familiar with where Reza is coming from, because we both very much invested in Badiou's approach to philosophy, to ontology, and his critiques of analytic philosophy. But I think that there are two good arguments generally in favor of framing this discussion in terms of let's say the analytic tradition of that debates ontology of art and so on, and that I think are quite refreshing if you have had any chance to spend some time with what happens on the same theme on the side of continental philosophy and so on. So I think the two things that are worth mentioning, the first is that, well, there surely is a smaller step, or at least it seems to me that it's an easier background today for two reasons: to ask questions from within, let's say, to propose a critique of an analytic approach to, for example, philosophy of art. It's easier to ask the right questions that will lead you towards something like what Reza is looking for. So I want the approach that I take into novelty and indeterminacy to be immanent enough to what is going on, not to require some sort of transcendental or let's say kind of a priori definition of what fits into it, and then a bunch of stuff in art doesn't fit. I want it to be flexible enough to do this, but I want it to be rigorous enough to also be extracting something determinate out of this discussion. So these complicated conditions, I think that for a very interesting couple of reasons, analytic philosophy today might be a better position to be the place where you pose these questions than if you started from the opposite tradition in the 20th century, continental approach, especially connected to Heidegger. Because the funny thing is that first of all, there is this aspect, right? I mean, the tradition from Carnap on, including Wittgenstein, is definitely much more ready to talk about modeling than the continental one. And second of all, especially Wittgenstein after the turn, the second one, the rogue Wittgenstein, there is a funny thing, which is when you talk about norms, you're talking about action. It's a theory of action. It's not really a theory of rules in this general sense of structure.
Yeah, it's not etched in stone. It's not a structure that is etched in stone that you can't change.
So
the Wittgensteinian notion of norm is yes, something that is a condition for, like, if you play chess, you have to obey the rules of chess. Okay, it's a condition for the success of a determinate action. Okay, but there is a whole reflection on the rule following paradoxes, which I will get to it in a short time. That are questioning questioning this picture of rules as something which is already there, etched in stone forever, something like that. So rules are both, in a sense, they have an empirical part and they have a transcendental part, in a sense. So they play both parts at the same time. So this is, I think this is, you helped me clarifying. I think this is a component which interests me in this kind of linguistic pragmatism, inferentialist philosophy, or linguistic pragmatism in the case of Wittgenstein, or inferentialist philosophy in the case of Brandom, of Wilfrid Sellars. That is the possibility of revision of norms. So norms are there, but they are passable. It's possible to revise them into something different. So, this is where I'm coming from. So yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, for me, the Heideggerian reflection on art, or the post-Heideggerian, was not really fruitful. I mean, for what I wanted to do. And what is interesting is that I feel that normally there's this idea that analytic philosophy is. I don't like using analytic philosophy because I'm also criticizing it. So I mean, but I'm defending Wittgenstein and the post-Wittgensteinian tradition, not analytic philosophy per se. But okay, there's this idea that analytic philosophy, because it deals with math, with logic and stuff, it's in a sense further from the phenomenon of art or of aesthetic experience or something like that. What I think is interesting is that for my own practice, I thought this was much more fruitful because it really helps you get into the inner workings of what constitutes a practice. You know, even though I think I'm not that well read in Badiou as you guys, but I think you can maybe, in a sense, use this kind of model of post-Wittgensteinian philosophy in order to get to the inner workings of a practice. I think, like a supplement, perhaps, something like that.
If I want, so another point of that was very useful, both JP and Gabriel. That answered my question somewhat, but I still wanted to make sure of one more thing, whether I heard you correctly. The way that I understand you approach a particular work of art, to me, makes that work of art more like a singularity rather than a conceptual or an instance of a universal definition or norm.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
In that case, then I am still a little bit at loss about the theoretical framework, because if the work of art, the approach, the framework wants to, the meta theoretical, or the theoretical, I should say, the meta art, if there is such a thing. I don't know how you want to name your framework, but
that's fine. I'll use what you're saying. I like it.
Yeah, the meta art. I mean, Badiou has a similar word for politics called meta politics.
Yes.
This meta art that provides a framework in order for us to think the singularity of the work of art. How would it use normativity because normativity is a conceptual framework, and this is exactly non-conceptual, or its singularity has to be captured in a non-conceptual way. I understand your reference, and I agree that analytical philosophy, especially the second Wittgenstein, would be but the way that I remember my logical investigations, he is still speaking about rules that are local to what does it call? Lifestyle, not lifestyle, but something else.
Forms of life. Forms of life.
Yeah, exactly.
The rules that are internal to forms of life. This is what he's
Forms
talking
of life. But the moment you apply those rules, then you are taking away the singularity. And I give you an example of this that, again, I'm using from Badiou, but maybe useful here without getting into too much detail. Badiou makes a distinction, and this is, I think, what is the difference between perhaps his approach and the approach that is more amicable. And I agree with Gabriel that analytical philosophy is much more, much closer to this paradigm probably than metaphysical or transcendental pedigree of continental philosophy. But he's making a distinction between logical and mathematical rules, or if I rephrase that, but from logical, which are universal, and mathematical, which are axiomatic.
Okay.
And in that sense, exactly with the singularity of the intelligibility, not conceptualization, the singularity of the intelligibility of, or the intelligibility that allows the singularity to be preserved while it is thinkable and intelligible, is preserved through the axiomatic framework, whereas universality of the logic is like a big paintbrush that paints every single instance according to the universal laws. Is this example helping, or is it confusing?
Both, I think. Yeah, I think it's helping in the sense that it helps me to articulate the view of logic that is in place here, which is from this second Wittgenstein on. It's not really logic; it's what he calls grammar. So grammar is not. I think it's problematic to cast grammar in the form of a universal law. I don't think grammar is like a collection of universal laws or something. Grammar is something. Grammar in the second Wittgenstein is like something like how do you say that?
Okay, so let me elaborate on this example. Yeah. Exactly the form of singularity is because the form of the genesis of the choice between laws or rules, or probably grammar, I put it in the same category, and axioms, because axioms are vehicles for experimentation, whereas rules are vehicles for conceptualization. And
yeah, I think, yeah, I understand what I partially understand what you're saying, because I think it comes from, it's like a tip of the iceberg. I think there's much more to be unpacked there in order for me to understand it properly, I think. But
just suggest something. To my worry is that I think that there's a good chance that, because one thing is the question, why enter into a specific debate with analytic ontology in order to develop what you want to develop? And another question.
Yeah, this is the first part of the question which I didn't answer yet, actually. Yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify that this is one question. Another question is, what is the, let's say this contemporary continental, or whatever you want to call Badiou's approach, is it more equipped than the analytic to deal with some specific thing that rather defined as the singularity of art? I think that it's too easy perhaps for us to fall into the general debate over the status of Wittgenstein's work or things like this, rather than, let's say, follow the thread that took you from the problem, what doesn't fit into the analytic framework, such as you criticize it and where you got. Because I'm just afraid that since you have material to cover, and there are reasons why you took this particular path rather than another.
Well, some of these reasons are contingent, but okay, there are reasons.
From my perspective, for example, I think some of them are not that contingent. For example, I find this a very particularly insightful problem that, for example, the continental approach, which for it, the question of art has usually been the question of technique, technology, work. Let's say it's a functional and dysfunctional. That's the dialectics between, is it functional or is it dysfunctional, let's say. But the problem is that this usually falls on this whole debate over the status of technique, poiesis, and opening, always in these terms. But that's usually, I think that it takes the standpoint of the reception of art. And I think that the analytic philosophical approach is much closer, and it opens up the black box of the production, because it substitutes the term production.
It's not much closer. It's what I'm doing with it is much closer to the opening the black box.
That's what I wanted to get at, exactly. I mean, I think that the general question that Reza is posing, which interests me a lot, because I do share with him a certain critique of the linguistic turn, a certain tendency towards a definitional conceptualization of entities, objects, and so on, and to define the universal norms that are sufficient to talk about things and so on. The question that I think is more specifically in place here is, considering that many approaches are deficient, many of the current approaches are deficient, there is something about the analytic approach that is, let's say, worth tensioning with and forcing in a certain direction, which I think is what you're doing, rather than accepting as it comes, right? The fact that
this is precisely it.
Yeah, you can take the normative approach closer to the approach, let's say, a more immanent approach of the artist to his own practice. That's the tension that I think you're imposing.
I just want to add one thing, and then I agree that we should continue. The reason that I'm bringing this up, because I learned, like Gabriel is saying, through the reading of works of Badiou, and then a little bit the work of Lazarou, that there is a very common flaw, that artists or politicians or politics, not politicians, politics or militants, they produce the work, they produce the singularity of the art form, and then theorists try to create normativities or norms according to which it can be explained. Whereas this is putting the cart before the horse. The point exactly is just the opposite, that the singularity is within the theory itself, not within the practice of that form. And the only way that the theory can keep up with the singularity of the work of art itself is to put this singularity within the theory itself. And the attempt to create the rules, the norms, is going to make the theory to fall into the same, to fall prey to the same same issue, same movement. That's all I wanted to mention. But
yeah, yes. Actually, all of this was developed as a immanently to my art practice, in a sense. So it's not really that I'm theorizing about some historical event that was John Cage and stuff. It's just because, as I told in my first proviso, my first preliminary consideration, this was the. I mean, I was trying in this doctorate to put forward the theory of punk Cage, you know. So there was a whole bunch of artists here in Brazil that was basically crossing the line of concert music. Some of them had some background in concert music and stuff, but not all of them. So most of them were noise practitioners and stuff like that. So it was crossing a line between practices, right? So there was a whole ecosystem of places here that was not in any way linked to universities and stuff, that was receiving this kind of rich in information, these works that are rich in information, in a sense. They are not your typical Adorno mass culture product, you know. They are rich in information, but nevertheless they are occupying like a popular music place. So this is where I was actually trying to get at. But Cage's example, I mean, it was a reference, an important reference for some of us. Amongst them, I should mention Valério Fiel da Costa, which is a close friend who tried to theorize about it through systems theory, Nicholas Luhmann and Bertalanffy and stuff. The idea of a morphology, and I will mention him in my PowerPoint in a while. But I just want to mention that this was actually immanently caught up in my artistic practice in this period. It's not really a theory about something odd. I mean, this can be actually a weakness of my philosophical position from a strictly philosophical sense. I admit it, because it is really caught up in my artistic practice and the artistic practice that I was seeing here. Of course, we didn't get to propose a generic practice at the end, but this is like the vector of this investigation. And from the philosophical point of view, strictly philosophical point of view, I can understand if someone, actually it's the opposite of what you're saying, Reza. I can understand if somebody thinks that this is not useful in any sense to think any other works of art, because this is just the theorization of my own practice, or something like this, or the practice of my pals, or something like this. But I mean, the result is in the pudding. I trust that result will be interesting enough to fit different practices that are ongoing in the world, that aren't really new music in the sense of concert music or popular music or popular practice of something like that. So I think it connects to a need. It addresses a need. There was this need to think ourselves, and I was using my doctorate to do just that, in a philosophically informed sense, with the approaches that I had under my belt, you know. But about just to answer the first question, which is very interesting, the question about the framework and the perceived mismatch between what I'm going to and from where I'm departing, which is the framework of analytic ontology. Yes, as I was trying to, I don't know if I made myself clear in the PowerPoint, it was always a critical relationship analytic ontology exemplifies precisely this is what Reza is talking about, the impulsion, the compulsion to theorize something and to lose its target. In a sense, theory comes too late and offers a universal concept of something like an artwork. But nevertheless, it encapsulates what the normative medium is, in a sense, in the sense of the norm, what is normal, right? So you can use it as a symptom, as something that encapsulates something which is real, but turns it into a metaphysical doctrine or something like that. So my relationship to analytic ontology of art is this one. I'm trying to use it to talk about the pre-systematic intuitions that somebody can have about what constitutes a piece of music, right? And also to criticize the impulsion towards the universal purification of these concepts, which ends up reifying something that doesn't have anything to do anymore with what is still going on immanently within the practice. So it's kind of there is an internal division there in my use of analytic ontology. So I think I should try to go on here, and maybe we can go back to these reflections after I talk a little bit more. Just here. Okay. So, why is post-Cagean aesthetics important? The aesthetics of John Cage also furnishes with two elements: a counterexample to common practice and analytic ontology regarding the necessity of a determinate identity for the musical work, right? A comment: there is a proper understanding of this indeterminacy by Cage himself and his milieu as an opening to what happens, or as an imitation of nature in its manner of operation. This is kind of interesting. I'll talk a little bit about this. B, against himself, the same as that happened with my use of analytic ontology. It's happening with Cage, against himself as well. An example that makes visible what I'm calling a normative turn in Cagean and post-Cagean aesthetics. Comment: against Cage, what I take to be crucial is not so much the openness of the work to its outside, but the ways in which this is achieved, the adoption of tasks to be completed by the musicians that make explicit the normative character of the practice. The normative in the sense that, I think this will answer some of Reza's concerns. The normative in the sense of there being some norms, not of being specific substantial norms. The normative character is a practice that is defined by some putative norms. We don't know which norms there are. Of course, empirically, we know there is an ongoing practice of musical creation which has some norms there and stuff. But what I'm trying to put is a difference between a formal norm and a substantive norm, right? So the practice, for it to be constituted, it must have some norms. We can produce norms. This is the idea, which is different to doing something that is not non-normative. There's no norms whatsoever. Which I think in Reza's talk, he was talking about the rules as something that is pertaining to conceptualization. So yes, that's precisely it. I think we must have norms in order to understand what something is. So this is actually a Cagean work against Cagean indeterminacy, against the idea that, oh, there is something that is purely chaotic which is produced. No, it's not purely chaotic, but it is it has a specific morphology, and this morphology stems from the adoption of norms, but these norms are not the norms that are already up and running in the practice. So this is the issue. So you have to harvest something from this normative turn, which is not a full-blooded contentful norm, right? It's just the form of a norm, something like that. So about the nature in its matter of operation, I'm using this beautiful expression by a Brazilian philosopher, Vladimir Safatli, that is Cage's stoicism, the Cagean question, which is actually Safatli's way of rephrasing it. What should be destroyed so that nature can appear in its manner of operation? So this is, Safatli doesn't really question Cage so much, but he has this beautiful way to put what Cage thinks he is doing. So what he thinks he's doing is in this page. I mean, it's my abstract of it. So the destruction of the compositional ego is supposed to open the work to the immanence of what happens. So this is what should be destroyed. So it's this synthetic function of a compositional and the listener's ego or something. So this is what this goes back to the question that Dennis posed in the beginning of the session about what is the formal integration. So this is where that's important again. So what does happen in the sense of the other phrase? The destruction of the composition ego is supposed to open the work to the immanence of what happens. So what does happen? Sounds themselves, free of organization, are spontaneously organized by nature. So nature for Cage is this spontaneous organization, which is always in excess of what is conceptualizable by the synthetic forms of the subject, right? So the artwork is supposed not to be made for the synthetic activity of the listener either. Both listener and composer must surrender themselves to a content not made by and for them. Imitating nature in its manner of operation is then freeing sounds from the organizer / composer. So this is actually the standard Cagean account of what he's doing. So here I come to morphology. So I use these two paragraphs. The one is by our comrade Cornelius Cardio, which is a very, very tremendous, impressive thinker of music. So he's saying, consequent on this comes the fundamental difference in thinking about the identity of a piece of music. For instance, constituting the identity of an European piece. He's talking here about classical European tradition or the Darmstadt tradition, like serial music, Boulez, Stockhausen, and such. So this is what he calls an European. No, this is previous to that one. This is still in his phase where he was dealing with indeterminacy, improvisation, free improvisation stuff. It's still not in Stockhausen serves imperialism.
Okay.
So this is previous to that.
Big guy. Okay.
Yeah. No, he has issues with Stockhausen, but those aren't the same issues that he come to have after during the communist I would say Marxist-Leninist, but there was a Maoist, so okay, the communist phase, whatever. So for instance, constituting the identity of an European piece are, e.g., the tones that occur in it and their characteristics, pitch, loudness, length, etc., in Boulez, for example, are the themes that occur in it, their implications, harmonic and melodic and modifications, etc., etc. On the other hand, constituting the identity of, for instance, winter music, which is the piece I show you, this one, right? So constituting the identity of winter music is the fact that there should be more or less complex eruptions into silence, and that these should come from one or more pianos. This is simple to understand. It's because you don't have any more the retraceability condition. You can't really retrace the results to a score or to an ideal of what the piece should be, unless you count this imprecise profile, like there should be more or less eruptions into silence as the idea of the piece, right? So the morphology here is this idea that the conditions of identification of works are being flexibilized in order to respond to these kinds of bodies of work, right? So there are many more forces of morphological disaggregation operating on the work than forces of conservation. Nothing prevents an individual from playing a work in a way that frustrates the expectations of the author or his project, either due to technical incapacity or due to a challenge to the order, negligence, or distraction. An entire system of ethics had to be established to reduce such danger by granting an individual or group precedence over others and constituting themselves as a reference capable of imposing order and keeping the musical work on its axis. This is from Valerio Fiel da Costa, the idea that okay, ontology presupposes that there is some stable thing there, which is a musical work. But in the world, in its trajectory in time, in history, there are many more forces of disaggregation of these works than forces of conservation. This is the idea. So, in a sense, it's okay. You can always segregate the levels, and ontology. Okay, ontology could be talking about the ideal conditions, or could be talking about the logical identity, which has nothing to do with empirical maintenance of this identity. I understand this, but the idea of Valerio is that is to understand the work as a system that has a certain form of behavior in time, and that is adjusting itself more or less to the environment. So morphology, again, morphology is the system's view of a musical work. It methodologically blocks ontological answers. This is my phrasing, right? It's not what Valerio was talking. He doesn't phrase it like this. It methodologically blocks ontological answers while keeping the ontological questions as guides for investigation. It tries to give a description of the system by investigating its trajectory in time, the history of performance of a given body of work. A system in the sense of Luhmann is characterized by functional differentiation. It is different from its surroundings. An open system is one which renegotiates its limits with its surroundings and or conditions. So there's this example, which is, I don't know if I will read from it, but it's a interesting analysis that was made by Cardew of this piece, very weird piece by Lamont Young, which is called X for Henry Flint, or Arabic numeral any integer for Henry Flint. There's, I don't know which one is really the right title. It appears with this piece appears throughout recorded history with both titles. So X for Henry Flint, which is basically, it is an unscored piece. There's no score, but everybody understands the concept. The idea is to have a cluster, a piano cluster, or a gong or a gong sound, something like that, and it's you decide a number of repetitions beforehand, and you just do the repetitions. It's really that simple. So he's trying to do what he thinks is a topological analysis of the space of the piece, which I recast as a morphological analysis. So he's saying, what is the nucleus of that piece? What the instructions? We may deduce that Lamont's idea embraced the following categories, and that he made decisions with regard to them. Decisions are given in parentheses. So, okay, there is a sound, which is, he decides is a cluster or a gong or a bucket of balls. Repetitions of a sound, which are uniform. A time interval, 1 to 2 seconds. An articulation of the time interval, a relatively short silence between the sounds, a dynamic, which is as loud as possible, not total duration of the piece, but number of sounds. You decide the number of sounds, then you do it. You don't have access to a previously determined duration, and a number of performance, usually one. These categories and their interrelationships constitute the matrix of the piece. The decisions relating to B, C, and D are expressively given by Lamontic. The decisions for A and F are definitely left open. E and G have been cursorily fixed, but without special mention. You don't have to memorize anything, nothing of that, right? It's just an example. The foregoing analysis concerns itself with the internal structure of the piece. There are other angles. Let us, for example, take a frontal view. What is interesting about the piece in performance from the audience's point of view? 1, its duration, and proportional to that. 2, the variation within the uniform repetition. 3, the stress imposed on the single performance and through him on the audience. Empirically, then, we can prescribe the area of the piece, a subgroup of the family of topologically identical pieces. Of course, a different subgroup of that family might produce a different set of interesting and essential features in performance, etc., etc., etc. Well, this is a very interesting kind of analysis where, for instance, he questions if, for instance, if you have to repeat a sound with 1 to 2 seconds of silence between them, what counts as a repetition? And also there is the instruction that it should be as loud as possible. So he takes issue with that. He asks, what does it mean to be as loud as possible? The performance should play as loud as possible each time, which results in the gradual, he uses precisely this expression in this essay, the gradual destruction of a human being, because the guy who's doing the sound will be just destroyed after like 100 repetitions, because he's always doing with a maximum of his force. Or should he take into account the number chosen of repetitions and do the as loud as possible repetition, taking that into account? That is, it won't be the maximum of force in each repetition, but it will be the maximum of force that he can do before wasting himself completely until the end of the piece, right? And there's other interesting things that he asks about. He asks, what is the model to be repeated? Should he take each sound as the model for the following one, or should he take the first sound as the model for all the others? So these are very interesting questions, and that produces fundamentally different results, right? And it's in the same piece, which is basically an instruction, a very simple instruction. So what are the articulating elements of a morphology? Different from natural systems, the musical work as a system is not simply and directly causally constrained, but respond to norms of behavior that are responsible for everything our culture calls a musical work. Its causal history, in the sense of morphology as the temporal trajectory of its form, reflects changes in norms of performance, composition, listening, commercialization, copyright, etc. Morphology is then articulated by a normative infrastructure, that is, both the norms of a practice that are already in place, the capacity for acting in accord with the rule, and the explicit rules put forward by scores and or individual works and or new forms of practice. The structure of this normative space somewhat replicates Robert Brandam's distinction between norms implicit in practice and explicit rules assertable through language. So here we get to a very bizarre thing, Wittgenstein's paradox, realism and regularism. So there's this, Brandam takes this implicit and explicit dualism from the rule-following paradox that Saul Kripke locates in the philosophical investigations of Wittgenstein. So the relevant paragraph is this. This was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule. because every course of action can be brought into accord with the rule. The answer was, if every course of action can be brought into accord with the rule, then it can also be brought into conflict with it. So there would be neither accord nor conflict here. So Kripke understands the first paragraph, which is this one of PI 201, as presenting a genuine skeptical problem, the apparently paradoxical situation that we seem to use language meaningfully. There is no fact about us that constitutes our meaning one thing as opposed to another, and consequently the possibility for actually meaning anything seems to disappear. So Brandon unpacks this paragraph into two interpretations of rule following, and this paragraph comes in a place in the Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, where he's testing these different interpretations of what counts as following a rule. So this is the problem. When he says no course of action could be determined by a rule, he's talking about if you think that a rule is an interpretation, needs an interpretation in order to be acted upon. So if there's an interpretation, then it should have a rule for interpreting the rule. So this is called a regulism paradox. Interpretation one is called regulism. And it is the idea that rules are always explicit statements about how to do something. Interpretation two is called regularism, and it is the idea that rules are regularities of behavior. So the first one is like a Kantian law, something like rules. There is only one kind of rule. Rule is an explicit statement about how to do something. Okay, so and the second interpretation is like more akin to like an empiricism or something like this. It's a regularism. It's like a habit, something. Rules are regularities of behavior, okay? So the problem with solution one is that every rule is an assertion. If every rule is an assertion, every rule must be specified by a rule about how to apply the first rule. And that makes it an infinite regress. One never applies any rule. Problem with solution two is that regularities cannot account for the normative character of a rule. Regularities aren't right or wrong, they just are. So in a sense, if you are regularist about rules, you can't really sustain the difference between, for instance, a correct rendition of a piece of music and an incorrect one. It's just a question of regularity. If this is there's a regularity in playing this way rather than that one, it is, so to speak, correct, but you can't really speak about correctness here. This is the problem. So random solutions to make rules implicit in practice. So there's much to be unpacked there. I won't be able to unpack today. And there's further, more than much to be unpacked, there's much to be developed there, because Brandon, one of the problems I take with the Brandon's account is the origin of norms. He says it's norms all the way down. So there's not a non-normative dimension which can be converted to norms, which of course it is Hume's problem. Okay, but it is almost like norms are innate in a sense. So Wittgenstein advances this idea when he says following a rule is a practice, a custom, an institution. Brandon, in addition to the Wittgensteinian priority of practice, proposes the idea that norms implicit in practice can be made explicit by normative vocabulary. Modal and logical vocabularies are the organon of this explicitation. So Brandon has these different stages of sentience, and then sapiens, and then there's logical beings. Sapiens, when there's verbal beings, you have sapiens, and then there's logical beings, which are beings that are capable to make explicit what they are doing when they make statements. So a statement is both something that is said and something that is done. This is very important. So to make explicit is to describe the normative infrastructure that connects a statement qua content and qua act to another. So there's this you just have to have the for now to have this if you're not familiar with this material, for now to have this intuitive grasp for the moment. Okay, so if you have questions, I can complete it. So just to finish this arch, right? Constitutive dissociations. This is the Henry Flint concept I was talking about previously. I find a principle running through these cases, which I call constitutive dissociation. Constitutive dissociations presupposes a genre with a standard protocol. In the genre, situations are established by ordainments. A reality exists because of somebody's rule. In the case of ordainments, right? You are stipulating something. Okay. Moreover, it is customary. Okay. It is customary in the genre for situations to have certain aims. A constitutively dissociated situation comes about because the instigator of the situation alters the aims of the genre from the customary aims without declaring so. Since the traditional aims are foregone, the instigator can evade or replace standard protocol with an inscrutable protocol, a contrived enigma. This is Flint's concept. He doesn't have this difference between implicit and explicit. So my reading that combines this post-Wittgensteinian thing with Henry Flint's concept of constitutive dissociation is this: rules as material, aesthetic nominalism, and constitutive dissociations. Just a minute, guys.
Caron has all the best names.
Sorry.
Aesthetic.
Somebody else. Yeah.
I had just a question.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
So in your previous slide, did you conclude that Wittgenstein and Brandom are regularist?
No.
Not.
No.
Okay.
No. I'm concluding that there is something that is not a regularity, but it's not either a explicit statement of a rule. So it is not. It's not regulism and it's not regularism. The paradox arises from an alternation of the regulist reading with the regularist reading. So when one thinks the regulist reading of rule following and finds the infinite regress, she changes to the regularist one. So there's this alternation that gives rise to this kind of aporia, right? This Kripke has a very dramatic page when he talks like the whole idea of meaning disappears into thin air or something, which is not very common in analytic philosophers to have this kind of drama with what he's reading, but it's that serious for him, this problem. So so Wittgenstein provides an answer in the same paragraph. The problem is it's a very cryptic answer, which is also usual with Wittgenstein, which is the idea that following rules is an institution, a custom, a habit, but not a regularity. That is, it is something that is part of a form of life. So it is a regularity, but not just a regularity. It makes use of explicit statements of rules, but are not just statements of rules. So it is a combination that pertains to the whole of the form of life. So there is a it is an institution in the sense so that this is actually a very thorny issue, because there are a bunch of different readings of this, but one of them is a communitarian view that the community decides what is appropriate, and every performance is correctable by the community. So this is what means to have an institution or something. There are individualist readings, something like Hocker and Baker, which concentrates on the idea that there is an autonomy of grammar, so it's grammar itself. But nevertheless, I think it's very easy to fall prey into one or the other. So you have to think that the concept of an institution of sense there, an institution of norms or rules, it has to, in a sense, neither be regularity, just regularities, neither just explicit statements of rules. So what Brandom tries to develop from this is the idea that there are like regularities, yes, of behavior that are taken to be correct by a determined sociality or something like this. This is this Hegelian rereading, analytic Hegelianism, right? The sociality of reason that you find in Pippin as well. So there's these norms that are the product of the interaction between agents in a social situation that combines both regularities that are taken to be correct or incorrect, and explicit statements that express the correctness or incorrectness of these regularities. So what he's trying to do in his project is to combine to supplement this Wittgensteinian pragmatism with some modified analytic Hegelian understanding of self-consciousness as the making explicit of the norms that are implicit in practice, or something like that. So
can I also add to Reza something, because you taught me, you sent me the reference that I think is helpful for people studying Badiou,
okay,
to make that
go on.
deep. Because
go ahead.
Reza, Caron showed me a really good text by that guy we like, who prefaced Lautmann's book, Fernando Zalamea. Zalamea has a text on the late Wittgenstein, especially, if I'm not mistaken.
Actually, it is an anonymous text that was proposed by Zalamea to the Glass-Bead Journal. I'm not sure if we are supposed to say that it is Zalamea's text.
I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, it's a text that the guy proposed, and he has the same name as Fernando Zalamea, but he's not. I don't know. The fact is that Zalamea has proposed or helped to spread a view in which the concept of rule and especially the concept of rule and the role of examples in late Wittgenstein has only found a proper formal expression in the idea of sheaves in category theory, in the sense that precisely what would have been introduced by Wittgenstein at that point, and especially for a guy who was so interested in mathematical logic, it's quite telling that he wasn't able to express this in any formal way, only by this kind of strange turn in style of presentation of his philosophy. But the fact that he had to present these fragments where you kind of partially cover aspects of what a rule or a certain implementation of a rule is by covering it with fragments of examples that don't really ever exemplify exactly the same thing. This sort of patchwork of examples that exemplify something that's never truly instantiated in any particular case. Zalamea says that for him, this is pretty much the basic structure of a sheet. This idea of gluing local instances that none of them truly function as the case of a universal concept. So there is, I'm very interested. I mean, we could go into other questions. I don't want to disturb Caron's presentation, but I think that there is a more subtle move from the sort of ambiguity that Wittgenstein has, and you see a whole kind of debate within the analytic tradition as to how to settle it into habits, and or which fall into this sort of reduction of rule following into a sort of regularity in habit, or you get the explicitation into a explicit determinate normative approach. There is a current approach, it's much closer to this discussion, that finds kind of a counterpart in formalisms that we've been exploring.
You have this text, you can share it with us?
Yes, absolutely. I really love the text. I will, it's my pleasure. I will send it to you. That
would be great.
Okay.
I have 9 minutes. I have to leave in 9 minutes.
Okay. It's close to the end. Okay, it's just let's wrap it up, and maybe if those who can stay, if they want to ask further questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But yes, it's close to the end. Just whoop.
Yeah, could you send me that text too, Caron?
Yes, of course. I'll send the group.
Okay, great.
Actually, I was deciding if I was going to do this presentation or the other one that Gabriel knows about this text from Zalameus.
Yeah, but that's where I'm cheating.
Yeah. Maybe the next one will be about Zalamea. So when the cycle comes in my position again, maybe I will do the Zalamea one. Okay. So rules. Did I read that? No. Rules as material, aesthetic nominalism, and constitutive dissociations. In my version, then, constitutive dissociations typically occur between the implicit norms of a practice and the explicit documents. Paradigmatically, a score, but any medium will do. Explicit documents presuppose implicit norms of practice, of course, because you have to know how to read something in order to have an explicit document. And this reading is an implicit practice that is a technique that one can master, right? It's a technique. So it's not really something that how to read is not really something that you can write a manual about with all the different subtle aspects of it, right? So it's the mastering of a technique. This is much closer to what Wittgenstein has in mind with the rules, right? So the idea is that there are norms of a practice. These norms are the results of these different masterings, and the explicit documents that can be contradictory towards the ideals of the practice under which they are being read or being practiced, right? So the implicit norms of interpreting correctly from a score forms a background to the practice of proposing explicit rules in the form of scores. Scores can be in disagreement with implicit norms. I have a whole bunch of interesting examples of this in the thesis, but I don't have the time to do this here. But anyway, this discussion can go on and on. So aesthetic nominalism revisited. So this is where I'm using this idea of constitutive dissociations and the idea of taking the norms as material in order to constitute different, not just different works, but different practices, right? As a kind of, and I'm connecting this to the idea of an aesthetic nominalism, which had two different meanings in the thesis. The one that was put forward by Goodman's rejection of abstract entities and universals, right? And Adorno's one. Adorno's idea that aesthetic norms after modernity aren't operative for the collectivity of artworks. So my version is the identity conditions of the works are internal to their functioning and are self-placed by the works themselves. The acts perform their own immanent criticism, even if they are constituted heteronomically by norms implicit in practice. So there is an autonomy and there is an heteronomy of the work. There is a relative autonomy of a practice inside something that is recognizable as a specific practice, and there is an heteronomy of each individual works towards the norms implicit in that practice, right? But which can be redefined if the putative work takes as its material these norms themselves. So this is the idea. Okay. So there's these strategies against an architecture of glass, because people, there's an interesting article by Brandon Joseph about Cage, how Cage wanted with his music was a kind of architecture of glass. That means some kind of structure that leaves the outside, leaves the structure open to the outside. You can see the outside from within, right? Not only the windows this year, even though they are small, will open. One whole wall slides and when I have the strength or the assistance to push it. And what do I enter? Cage asks once more, taking a swipe at Le Corbusier. He hated Le Corbusier, John Cage. No, not proportion, the clutter of the unkempt forest. This idea that there is this immanent nature that produces differences, and his work, the artwork for him is kind of a vehicle for this expression of nature as in its manner of operation, which is always in access to the subjective manner of operation and stuff. So our morphological study takes the normativity of the action and its relation to the context of production as a material for composition and as a springboard for the constitution of normativities and other identities. In this sense, the work is not transparent to the world, which is Cage's ideal, right, anymore in its indeterminacy. But this indeterminacy is a product of constitutive dissociations, which are interventions in the infrastructural normative fabric of the production of works itself. So it's not that the work is transparent to the world, but the work takes its conditions of constitution as material for its own constitution. So this transparency is not transparent. This transparency is basically mediation, right? So
if I get it correctly, like also, could you, just to make sure if I understand it, could you go just quickly to the slide with Henry Flint's definition?
Okay. Yeah. Constitutive dissociations.
Yeah.
This one.
Presuppose the genre with a standard protocol. So a constitutively dissociated situation comes about because the instigator of the situation alters the aims of the genre, meaning.
Yeah, I don't like his phrasing of it.
Sure. Because what I want to get at is that if I understand your strategy, I think that now I would summarize it in the following way. First, you do take preference with the overall decision of a certain analytic tradition to read, let's say, this, right? It's a question of being, as you said, it has something to do with ontology, because by opting for the question of totality, and meaning you already arrive at the problem of art from the standpoint of rules, norms, actions, processes. You're taking a choice by approaching it like this, in opposition, for example, to the approach that takes it, that rather than starting with the idea of process, starts with matter, material, and then you get into a totally kind of classic continental approach where you get art works on something, this something is relevant, it has determinations or has indeterminations, and technique puts determinations, we want to take those determinations out, that brings us closer to being as such. You know, you can see a connection between, let's say, art as not really, I would say that the question of ontology as you pose it reflected into two approaches to art. Art as process, which is following from the analytic approach, which is following from ontology as totality, because you're already asking which rules will, what statements or formulas will allow me to extract art out of a general multiplicity. So I'm already arriving at it with a problem of separation, of well-formed definitions, and so on. And so it gives us an approach that focuses on practice and action, abstraction as an action. And on the other hand, you have art as material, which I think follows more closely to the idea of ontology as being as such, right? Because the question of determination and indetermination will tend to take the form of either matter is indeterminate, meaning it's close to being in some sense, and technique will further determine it, or matter is determined and technique is a way of producing indetermination out of it, but this becomes somehow difficult to talk about because we don't have that many concepts to talk about practice from that approach. But I see you taking the decision.
Mathematics.
Yeah, I mean, for the continental Heideggerian approach, right? I don't think that.
So, what you are getting somewhere? What what you're saying that I pass through that I'll tell you what I think I'm doing. So maybe it's what you were talking. Maybe that is what you're talking about. I'm trying to supersede analytic ontology from within.
Yeah, but what I wanted to get at, this is not important. Was just a speculation on why the definition of the question already kind of forms a path. But in any way, I think you take a first decision, which is very clear that, I mean, we're going to start the issue from within the analytic approach. This means that we get to ask questions about norms, which is not obvious. I mean, I think this should be clear. Like, it's not the common ground today in artistic practice, at least from what I know. I'm not that familiar, but I'm mildly familiar. It's not, let's say, the common sense today is that the key word is material and not norm. The idea that, let's say, organization comes first and the material which is organized comes second in the order of reasons is not the common sense. So this is already an important decision. Convincing people that this is important is already taking a stance, and I think that this is where, let's say, the fact that you have a particular artistic practice rather than another is influencing things, because you do take an approach to artworks where you're asking about the organization of the material, not so much asking about material as a black box that just emits something. So it makes sense that you're criticizing a reading of Cajun and post-Cajun aesthetics that is based on putting matter first, organization second. But then I think, of course, you're criticizing the common sense approach within that decision, which is taking norms as a sort of kind of totally determined set of rules that you can either take or reject full, like black and white. And what I wanted to get at that I think will bring us closer to what Reza was asking about axioms and so on is that you first introduce this decision concerning norms. Second, you take a definition of what a norm is and you approach it from a more pragmatic than, let's say, positivist approach in the sense of...
Yeah, it's more pragmatist than model theoretic in the sense of Tarski and stuff. So.
Yes, you're not interested in reducing a rule to a well-formed statement. You're very much accepting the richness of that late Wittgenstein, where you get... It's explicit, but if you want to keep it implicit and you want to keep both within a certain kind of contextual contour. You need both implicit and explicit to define what Flint called a genre with a protocol, right? Which Jungians would call a world, pretty much. And then that's where I want to understand better, because the stroke, the turn there that I find that you could have perhaps been more explicit about it is that what this idea that Flint brings into the picture is that he proposes a definition of indetermination, which he calls an enigma. There's a specific adjective.
Contrived
enigma within a genre, within a situation that is not produced by the suspension of a rule, but by the confrontation of a set of existing rules with an added one.
Yes.
What I thought he didn't call very nicely when he said is an instigator that changes the aim. Well, changing.
I don't think it's changing the aim. Actually, I think this is secondary. It is changing really the explicit part of the situation. I mean, the implicit is there, and you change something that you can model it on Cage. He's really talking about indeterminacy. So you can think about 433 as I told before. There is a customary protocol to play piano piece in concert in front of an audience. There is a customary protocol for the audience. The audience must keep silent and must listen to whatever is coming out of the piano. So what he's talking about, the instigator, which is Cage, changes the aim because the pianist is not playing anything. So this is a contrived enigma. This is something weird. I don't know. But I think it's my take on it is that it is actually first more structured than what Flint says. I think it's more structured because there is an explicit and implicit dimension, and secondly, it's not. It's more. It can go further than what he's saying. I think you can at least potentially propose new forms of practice, which maybe won't be art anymore, because you can propose explicit rules on top of an implicit norm that are is really what you said, that are contradictory towards the norms of practice. I mean, in the sense, contradictory with the aims of the norms, right? So the norms are, you have to keep silent in order to hear something coming out of the piano. So there's nothing coming out of the piano. So there is a contradiction in the sense that what you are taking a certain kind of behavior of position, which intends to listen to something, and there's nothing. So this is just, but I don't like to be too much focused on the historical examples, because what I'm interested in is in taking a abstract formal model out of this in order to propose different things. So Cage is just is an historical important initiator of the tendency, and his works are just heuristic works. I think you can go further. I mean, so yes, I totally agree with the idea that you can have a part of a practice that is in contradiction with another part. What I think is what you said, right, Gabriel?
Yeah, not necessarily contradiction, but I mean, it seems to me that ultimately where we arrived at is that you're proposing a reading that has these three characteristics, and none of them are, let's say, common sense to the discussion or, say, more immanent theorization and of art practice today. The first is that there is something to be gained. Let's say there will be more intelligibility by arriving at the material through the question of rules than arriving at rules through the question of materials of art, which I think is the choice for a general, broad analytic approach, which already implies that there will be more intimacy between a formal approach than one could expect to an art discussion. Second, you take, within that discussion, you're prudent in not choosing an interpretation of what rules or norms are, which would end up requiring you to espouse that view of, let's say, normative analytical discussion on art that ends up being definitional and ultimately, kind of, as you said, detaches yourself from your target, because you're already saying that these targets, what you're modeling is very elusive as to what constitutes the totality of the application of a rule. And third, and this is the one I wanted to focus on, is that in this one, as I said it now, that I think it's a very nice way of putting it, there is more and not less structure in the processes that arrive at something indeterminate. And what this constitutive dissociation idea suggests, from what I understood it, is precisely that the introduction of an additional rule, we're not saying that it's contradictory.
Yes, I see.
Claim that perhaps it shouldn't be, right? It's a supplementary rule in some sense, right? And
yes,
and I think that it has a. I mean, the case of Cage, I think it's very. I mean, it's a classic example, but it's good because the silence it's not introduced ex nihilo, to pun intended. It's introduced by the fact that it was always already presupposed there, right?
Yes,
right.
yes.
So the norm is actually making intelligible something that was always already there, but the norm itself is kind of added.
Yes. Yes, by a norm that is added, you make visible something that was there, and retroactively you get to see the inner workings of a normative practice, in a sense. So this is my proviso here down that I didn't read. This shouldn't be taken as a de facto statement for every work in history, but a retroactively posited possibility that was harvested from post-Cagean aesthetics. So retroactively, you can, in a sense, this normative term makes visible these inner workings of this like infrastructure that makes it possible to listen to a work of music. But now you are not producing a work of music; you are using this infrastructure itself as a material, in the sense of being something that you are modifying in your practice, in this sense,
so,
right?
Could we close with the slogan, turn matter into rule? Because, you know, that's exactly what an axiom does. It extracts from nothing. You know, it turns this inconsistent matter of a background into a certain extra determination for experimentation, as Reza was trying to arrive at in the beginning.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Silence is a matter that is in a position to form, but then you can intervene in a situation in such a way that silence begets part of the form.
Yeah.
I like this ontomorphology. Yeah, that sounds very much like
this ontomorphology and ontomorphology, right? So, and it's just this is my closing remarks, and it has to do with what we were saying about the analytical ontology and the continental one. Analytical ontology from here on, ontology 2, I'm calling it ontology 2, can be recast then as a form of seeing as. One sees something as a work of art if there are specific conditions for such, typically institutional conditions. It does not deal with objects, but with our relationship to objects as results of practices. Morphology displaces ontology to the background. The conditions that comprise ontology are the individuation criteria for a process, not an object. It is because we have those seeings as that we can individuate a given process, for instance, called Cage's 433, and follow its trajectory. We follow its trajectory. Ontology proper is still to be specified. In doing this, a dislocation of the ontology was performed, wherein it passes to the background as the conditions of said trajectories. It isn't interested anymore in fixating definitions to the empirical objects and or social practices, but in asking about the structural conditions that have to be there for the verified transformation of practices. Ontology 2 folds back into ontology 1 if it wants to be ontology. So if not, ontology 2 is seeing as, the phenomenological description of seeing as that are responsible for determining, for instance, something to be an artwork. It is a phenomenology that is not only concerned with sensible contents, but with meanings attached to sensible contents by language-mediated social practices. Okay. I know there's a lot in this closing remarks, but this is on purpose. This is the thing that I want to discuss with you guys in other meetings, right? The project of form and scale follows from the recognition of the centrality of seeing as to contemporary political projects. It harvests the results of our investigation of a particular vector of escape from a particular field of practice, music, and tries to generalize it with the addition of the problem of scale. If ontology 2 is now a function of social practices in general, it demands a relation to the social totality. So this is our problem with our courses and stuff.
Yes, it's a very, very simple.
Yeah. The escape from art, one seems to, this is a Seller's quote, one seems forced to choose between the picture of an elephant which rests on a tortoise, what supports the tortoise, and the picture of a great Hegelian serpent of knowledge with its tail in its mouth. Where does it begin? Neither will do, for empirical knowledge, like its sophisticated extension, science, is not rational, not because it is, it's rational, not, it is, what? It's rational because it is a self-correcting enterprise which can put any claim in jeopardy, though not all at once. So the dissolution of art in life, which I was talking about, based on this Peter Bürger guy, is not a wholesale, but a piecemeal business. Art's participation is analogous to what Seller says about scientific knowledge. Constitutive dissociations open a transformative vector in art practice, wherein components can be revised theoretically until a new practice, not necessarily art anymore, can emerge. This research has been a quest for this genericity. So, and questions for development, relationships between indeterminacy at work and form and scale, the recasting of ontology as a form of seeing as, as a guide for the individuation of processes paves the way to the investigation of form and its mediation with scale, in the sense that scale will be defined solely on the basis of the theoretical elements disposed here as an intervention in form that calls for the participation of the concept. Intelligence retrieves that which escapes imagination, Kantian Sublime. I know we have a discussion about that. Okay.
Just before I forget, I think it's crucial. Okay. I just realized this. This statement I just proposed as a sort of slogan for your research, let's say, to theorize in which sense matter can be displaced, right? Can be made to be can be seen as part of a rule, right?
Mm-hmm.
Turn matter into a rule, that's to scale something.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely, yes.
It's literally how you move from treating it as a punctual substance to a structured set of
yes, you have something, matter, something that is a primitive, that is in a sense intractable, right? So turn matter into rule is to turn it into a tractable thing.
Yeah. So
this you are absolutely right.
No. I see the connection now clearer, between.
Yes, absolutely. The taking by the individual work of its conditions of constitution as material for elaboration, such as the category to its instantiations, and the site to that which lives in it, the site of the presentation, right? This proposes a relationship between the general and the particular yet to be investigated. Morphology has cast light on the problem of organization, not only sensible but normative. Is it possible to think of a general morphology of the social, political, economical processes from this model? Morphology and Marxist critique. I want to develop that. This is a quote by Ray Brassier. Concrete social activity generates abstractions in consciousness. These include the individual, property, productivity, population, the market, society, nature, nation state, law, right, etc. They can be contrasted with the critical form determinations through which Marx diagnoses the sought abstractions as the ideological masks of real abstractions. Commodity, money, labor, value, production, exchange, et al. Uncovering the form determinations of the capitalist totality reveals how a category like society misrepresents this contradictory totality as a concrete whole. This is a problem. Well, this of course is connected to the whole cognitive mapping problem we've been discussing, and now to this specific form that the relationship between local to global is being defined for this form and scale project, stemming from this relationship towards ontology as a form of seeing as that is structured by, in a sense, normative infrastructure that justifies this thing as being the thing as what it is, right? So if there is transparency between these norms and what these norms are stipulating to be the case, I mean, the norms stipulate something to be like an art practice, for instance. But if there's misrepresentation, as the Brassier quote is specifying, there is a whole problem of unpacking also this mediation. I mean, this further mediation, which was not developed in this work and maybe will be present in the form and scale project, I think. So this is the end of it.
No, yeah, man, this is a lot of stuff. I really wish we had more time to questions, but I would propose, I mean, we need to talk this through perhaps during the week in our chat as to who's presenting next, if it's me or if Reza wants to do it. But I would suggest that perhaps we could take the first half an hour or even the first hour next time to tackle some of the questions. Because, for example, if I'm presenting, I know that there are connections. We could go from a debate over what you presented today towards my work. Not that difficult. Or I know Reza as well could definitely make the connection. So perhaps we could also use some time next time to
have a debate, in a sense, to go through this material.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like it would be a missed opportunity not to, just kind of detail some stuff a bit more. But like this last thing you were talking about reminded me of a totally not crazy, but a weird theory that I have. Like I tried to define for myself some time ago what I think is pop music, like the minimal trait that connects all pop music. And the best solution that I came is a solution that concerns scale, which is it's all music that when you're playing it, you can listen to the whole of it and not to a part of it. So any music that your capacity as a musician is not challenged or is put to use in such a way that you can listen to everything that is going on as it's being played, tends to fall within something that we recognize. I mean, if you put this definition to practice, a lot of pop music falls within it, and a lot of what's understood as not being pop falls outside. But I was always trying to find a definition for.
So you are trying to define the definition of pop music that is at the level of the synthetic unity of a certain subject. If you get to hear everything that's going on, it's pop. This is what you're saying.
Yeah,
something like that.
From the perspective of people producing the music and not from its reception.
Producing, okay.
Yeah. So the point is, for example, if you can, how to put it like this? Like if you're listening as a musician, can be in the position where you're in the same place of everyone who's listening to it while you're playing, then it's pop.
Oh, I see. Like there's a shared seeing as. When there's a shared seeing as, you are in a pop.
Yeah, even for the
pop
music,
world.
This is the only definition of music that I know.
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting.
That explains why pop musicians dress as if they're listening to their music.
That's interesting.
All other music that you don't have that direct relation between reception and production. So pop music would be the music where you produce as if you're receiving it, because somehow the technical aspects need to be contained and structure needs to be contained to a level in which you can be listening to the whole piece as you're playing it. Whereas most music, you cannot. The listening that's required of you to perform doesn't allow you to take that position. So there is a break between production and reception in that point.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if it's true, but that is interesting.
Really. But I just like that it has a very nice relation to that Brassier quote. concerning society
Yeah.
and its representation of
Yeah.
abstractions. That's pretty much how you could definitely go and cast it in those same terms. Anyway, that's my contribution to the philosophy of art.
Okay. So thank you, guys. I think I've extrapolated the time, so yeah, definitely we should keep discussing this in the chat, and maybe yes, if we decide to have like still a half an hour of discussion about this next time, I'll be glad to do it for sure.
Yeah, I could really use an extra half hour because there were a couple things at the end that I didn't really follow, and I also had some questions on the definition of analytic ontology, because I was wondering, but we don't have enough time now, but for next time, if we could discuss how you would respond to like Kripke's causal theory of naming, because I was thinking about the questions you brought up in the beginning, those 4 questions of how to identify an artistic work. I mean, Kripke's whole criticism of it seems to line up exactly with yours about nominalism, what he calls descriptivism.
But then he gets to his solution is rigid designator. So
yeah, exactly. So I wonder how you would compare what you're saying to the rigid designator theory.
Yeah, that's very good, very interesting question, but I have to rehearse in order to answer that, because I don't have in mind a specific relationship, because one thing is of course you can cast those 4 questions as some kind of descriptivist framework, which I'm criticizing.
Yeah,
but at the same time is a work of art, a rigid designator. It can't be. It's not a proper name, So there's a problem that is not, at least from what I remember, that is not really thought out by Kripke. He's mainly putting forward a theory of proper names. So, okay, maybe you can have rigid designators for individual works, but this leaves open the question of the specificity of the normative practice of it being a work of art,
Yeah,
so
definitely.
I'm not sure
I think it would only apply.
I'm not sure how he would answer this question. So you're asking me about Kripke, I would ask Kripke about me. So.
Yeah.
I think then it's that in set theoretical terms, the problem would be if the most singular thing you can have is like a singleton, where only one referent can fall under the name, and that's singularity, right? The name, a proper name is a theory of singularity, where singular is to grasp one thing,
right?
And I think the problem of singularity for art is precisely moving away from the connection between the proper and the unique in that sense, and moving towards the connection between the unique and something that remains repeatable, even though it's unique, right? So you want to break the reciprocity between uniqueness and impossibility to repeat. Because, for example, the question of music and performance, and what Caron was, the way he began with the question, seemed to me already that problem. Like, I don't want the score to be a designator for one thing. I want the score to be the designator of a process, or to be in relation to a process, and that process is what we want to be even though it's multiply instantiated, right? Like,
I agree.
It's never posed to Kripke.
I would,
right? If John is multiply instantiated, there are many Johns. We're no longer talking about John as a proper name in the sense of what designates John and nothing else.
That's true, but I wonder if maybe I need to reread Kripke here. But I was thinking about the idea of causality as the main determination, because you could say, for example, that any work, any performance that was caused by the score in question is that work of art, right? So there could be many performances of that.
Yeah,
but
true. Okay. That doesn't really. Yeah, I see.
Yeah, there are theories that take into account the causality. Yes, Yes, there are some, but causality is hardly sufficient to account for the identity. Usually in the literature, hardly sufficient to account for the identity of an artwork. Just the causality. I mean, you have causality, yes, but some other specifications in general.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of a
one interesting question, for instance, is one interesting question that is in the literature. If it's possible to intend to play one song and end up playing another one, for instance, so the causality is kind of lost there. So this is just a question. I don't have the answer. There's a whole bunch of thought experiments about this. Another one is if supposing that an individual work is the result of the action of a certain individual composer, the artist, whatever. If it's possible for two different composers, painter, artists to produce the same work, for instance, this is another question that is in the literature about the subject. Maybe I will check Kripke, and maybe I will check these thought experiments, and maybe I can come up with something for you next time.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay.
This was your only question, Dennis. You have other questions?
Yeah. The other one was just to clarify the role of scale, just to see if my understanding was correct. But I think we can leave it for next time. Because
this is more perspective. This is not a finished work, so this is more perspective. So yes, this is something I'm working on. But of course, it will be much more helpful to me to discuss this actually than the finished work. So yes, I'm very interested in discussing this issue. So next time.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Guys, I really need to go. I'm totally.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, guys, take care.
You too. See you guys later.
Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.